Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. All right, welcome to the Genetics Podcast, everyone. I'm excited to be here today with Jocelynn Pearl, who's the Director of Cancer Cell Therapy at the TAM Center, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. What caught my eye about Jocelynn and why we decided to do this podcast together is her background and experience has included a lot of really varied things in a relatively short period of time. So also podcast host, experience in biotech, experience in genomics and systems biology. And, that's just the beginning. Just a couple of highlights here. Jocelynn spent her graduate years co-mentored by Dr. Nathan Price and Dr. Leroy Hood, who's, they're famous for their work in understanding multiomics and how it relates to lifetime risk of neurological disease, cardiovascular disease, and other major conditions that are multi-system, multi-organ diseases. So we're going to do a little bit of a tour today through a couple different areas of genomics and precision medicine. But Jocelynn, thank you so much for joining us, and great to have you here.
Thanks, Patrick, for having me on the show.
I'd love to start actually with the Institute for Systems Biology and some of what you worked on and learned there. That was back in the mid 2010s, 2017, I think is when you left. You started in 2014. I'd love if you could just talk a little about what you're working on then in systems biology and what you've seen that evolve to through now, because genome sequencing was about 10 times the cost then compared to today. And things like proteomics were probably barely on your radar or not too expensive to do at large scale. I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about how much that's changed in the last few years.
Yeah, it's been really incredible to see what was then somewhat of a nascent idea. I mean, Lee Hood founded the Institute for Systems Biology several years before I joined the lab, but he was one of the pioneers in this space of, I think, science is moving in this direction of needing to understand multiple data types. He was involved in the Human Genome Project, so he was familiar with the genomic boom. But he was one of the first to recognize that there were all these new layers of information that were going to be accrued and also something that we could apply to understanding disease, and understanding disease transitions in particular was something we were really interested in at the time. Like, how does someone go from this state of wellness or health to a state of disease? Like, what happens along the way, and tracking that longitudinally. And when I joined ISB as a grad student, it was one of a number of places you could do your PhD work as a student at the University of Washington. But it wasn't even really that popular, I guess. Like, it was kind of still a niche thing to do, and was seen as a bit outside of the norm, right? Yeah. And I think now that's changed. Like, if you look at just cancer care in general, there's a much greater appreciation, I think, among people seeking treatment to understand their disease on multiple levels, on the genetic level, in addition to pathology, for instance. And also, just when you go to conferences now, a lot of people incorporate different data types. A lot of people are applying methods to tie together those data types that were being developed at that time when I was a grad student. So it's cool to see it become more of this accepted field, and also just the way we kind of navigate information about disease or other parts of biology.
And after that, you did a postdoc where you focused on T cells. Then you spent time at two different biotechs, both on different aspects of either epigenetic editors or cancer immunotherapies more broadly. I'd love to just hear a little bit about actually what made you decide to go into industry. We have a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are either have moved from academia to industry or in academia and thinking about it. And it's a big decision when you're at that point in your career. And I'm curious how you approached it, whether it was an easy one for you and you always knew you wanted to go into biotech or not.
Yeah, I like to joke with people that I grew up in biotech, and by that I mean my first job, following, a internship in a lab at UC Berkeley, was at a biotech company in the Bay Area called Sangamo Biosciences, now called Sangamo Therapeutics. And so, really, my first real professional experience was working for this early team at Sangamo, and like really working on very translational projects that had the potential to benefit patients. And that felt extremely thrilling to me at the time. I mean, some of those projects involved knocking out chromosome 21 in trisomy 21 cells, developing a way to apply gene editing to create sheep models for cystic fibrosis. And, all of those projects really felt to me like this is what I want to be doing. And I carried that through grad school. And of course, there at the time there was still very much a dichotomy or divide of like academia versus industry, and I don't know, we create these false narratives in a way of like them being very different, right? But I always knew I wanted to go back into something that was applied, like applied science. And I also was very much drawn to the simplicity in a way of engineering cells and adding gene edits or epigenome edits, and the beauty of like putting in these things to cells and seeing the result very effectively. That was one of the areas I really loved. So when I was seeking a postdoc, I did several interviews. I interviewed at labs at UCSD, UCLA, Mount Sinai, kind of did the whole tour, and had the opportunity to work with some mentors that I had worked with previously at Altius Institute in this postdoc, and really go back to that space of engineering cells and modifying them in these specific ways. In that case, it was to enhance T cell therapies so that these CAR T products, which we knew at the time were very effective in treating certain types of blood cancers, but we knew they were getting exhausted in solid tumor cancers like like breast cancer, lung cancer. Right. So, our approach was, can we enhance or repress certain genes in the T cells so that they're more effective at treating, these solid tumor cancers? And we published, or we shared a preprint of some mouse data showing that multiplex repression of those T cells for some of these checkpoint ligands actually allowed a better tumor response in mice. And that led to some collaborations with some of the other organizations in the area. But yeah, it was for me just kind of going back to what I loved, which was essentially cell engineering.
Yeah, it's interesting that you had the prior experience at Sangamo, that going into your PhD, you knew that there was a whole other world of interesting translation research. I had something very similar, a shorter period of time, but I did an internship at Invitae, which is a genetic testing company, and then I went and did my PhD. But I had a very similar experience, honestly, of the kind of research and the depth of work that was going on while I was there was not different from the depth of work that was happening in the academic environments I was in. So that was an interesting proof point for me already that really good research happens both in industry and academia. I think it's, to your point, I think it's changed a lot these days. The I think even 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it felt a little bit more like if you wanted to do serious science, you had to stay in academia. That was the narrative that you got in academia. I don't think you get that narrative very much anymore. While you were working in biotech, I think you also gained a pretty significant following online, in part because I think you developed a little bit of a network and a perspective on decentralized science. It's something that people may have heard of, but I don't think we've ever discussed it on this podcast. And something I'm curious to pick your brain on because I think my perspective on it is that we know that the way that science is funded is not perfect, right? We have debates about big science, small science. Do we need a Manhattan Project for everything, or do we just fund smart investigators with crazy ideas and let them do their thing? But there's a whole new model which is using the blockchain and enabling groups to effectively form capital around ideas in a decentralized way. There's obviously a lot of scams mixed up in some really good science, but you spent a lot of time in that world. So I'm curious to get your perspective on it and what kinds of things did you work on? What did you find interesting and what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, there was this period during the pandemic where I think a lot of us were spending time online, and I was always, I guess, immune to the crypto world. I was familiar with the concepts and familiar with Bitcoin, but it was actually when Beeple, this artist, had this sale, this massive sale of an art piece.
I remember that.
Yeah, an NFT, and I was introduced to the concept of fractionalization of ownership using the blockchain, which I found really interesting. And I started thinking about publications and how science is published and just the incentive structures behind them, and just went down this crazy rabbit hole of applying some of these themes from things like DeFi to science. Like, what would it mean to change the incentive layer of science? What would it mean to create new organization types and decentralize ownership of these organizations? What does it mean to build teams across the globe that are in many different countries and work together towards some end, or even lowering the bar and lowering the barrier of entry for these online groups? Like I've used the analogy of like Reddit forum on steroids, where instead of just discussing the science, you're actually finding ways to do the science together in a decentralized way. So I was always really attracted to the themes, the principles, and really the conversations that were happening. And that's why I ended up starting a little company called Ultra Rare Bio, where we did a lot of research on the space. We would publish these maps of all of these different areas. So DAOs and people working on changing publishing, people working on new organization types. There's a lot of different flavors in there, and everything is in a Google Doc that's on my website called the DeSci Wiki. So it's all open source. Anyone can read about it. And then I was also involved in starting a group called LabDAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. And our original vision was, how do we create tools so that anyone across the world can do science, essentially? Like, can we create an online marketplace for the tools you would need, everything from computational biology to experimental biology? That project is now led by Nicholas, and it's more focused on the computational tools. It's called LabBio now. Recommend people check it out. It's really awesome suite of tools, including some of the latest and greatest algorithms for doing things like molecular docking and online drug discovery, as I call it. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey to observe the space and see how it's developed. And there was just a really big announcement for Bioprotocol, one of the original kind of groups. There's been some new token launches, which is essentially how people raise money in the crypto Web3 space. But yeah, I recommend people check it out and learn about it. We did some podcast episodes interviewing people from more the perspective of how do you go about creating access to information or allowing others to come in and do science. So families with rare diseases, how do we open source tools for them to do their own drug development? And that's something Ethan Perlstein leads. He just started a DAO. So yeah, it's an exciting space. I still think there's a lot happening, and I'm excited to promote it in whatever way I can and really help mentor people in this space.
Yeah, let me try to explain it, and you can punch it up and tell me where it's right, where it's wrong, or other places where I'm out of date. So if I think about just a generalized DAO like the one that you mentioned that Ethan Perlstein is working on, or others like Molecule DAO is a relatively high profile one that I'm familiar with. Essentially, I think the way that it works is instead of funding research in the traditional way where you go and get a grant or you start a company and you raise money, you can crowdfund the money by selling people tokens, and those tokens will have a name that may be related to the project or may just be something fun. But those tokens ultimately often represent ownership in the underlying IP or future revenue streams. I think you can structure it in lots of different ways, but the idea here is suppose you had an idea for a novel therapy for a rare disease, and you weren't getting traction with biotechs, or you just were interested in doing it another way. You could actually crowdfund from families affected by the disease, for example, to do the research, run clinical trials, and then those families may actually own a stake in the underlying asset. Is that roughly right? Where am I out of date,
Yeah.
or how
No,
can I
I think
improve that?
that's perfect. I mean, I like one of the things that became clear to me from working in this space is that it's just different names for the same thing at the end of the day. You can think about a token like money. You can think about who's running this DAO, the group of people who are kind of overseeing it as the board members. It's not that different from our traditional corporate structures that we're familiar with, and the token represents equity and fundraising, right, and
Yeah.
shares in that group. The way it gets run might be different, and in some ways might be better or worse, so there's a lot of people learning how to run a different type of organization, and there's actually a really good book called Reinventing Organizations that I have in the DeSci wiki. I recommend people checking out because, again, this concept isn't new. There's people who have been starting companies that are co-ops. There already were kind of different types of organizations you could start, but this is now on the blockchain, right? So it's a kind
Yeah.
of different layer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I like these kind of experiments and how you organize people and ideas and money because you don't know which ones are going to work. But there's a lot of good ideas that don't get funding because they don't have the network or connections or something like that. So there's obviously you have to have safeguards in place to make sure that people don't get scammed. But I think there's a useful and important nugget in there that I'm interested to learn more about.
Yeah, and my thesis was always um basically, like we talked about, there was this dichotomy of doing science in academia or doing science in industry, and those two worlds incentivize specific types of science. So in academia, you're predominantly incentivized to publish in the best journal possible to advance your career, and that's tied to your salary and your stability and a lot of very inherent
Important
things that
things.
we
Yeah.
drive towards. So and to do the research you have to write grants, so it's a very specific flavor of science that happens in my perspective. And those scientists are not necessarily equipped or have the budget or have the know-how to then translate those insights that they're discovering into something that can help people, right? Or really be accessible to the public. Um, and on the industry side, you're incentivized to um, do everything you can to make that company a success. And that's often tied to your equity and your salary and your shares in this company. And usually it's structured as, filing patents and even, your science might happen as a trade secret. Like it might not ever see the light of day in the sense of something that someone else can read or disseminate. So I call it like the black box of biotech because there's so much amazing science and research that happens in these environments that just never see the light of day. And therefore, once that company gets bought or sold and those assets might sit on a shelf or and I think that's sad. Like I think we need to explore other ways of doing science, of incentivizing people, and really, really like not live in these stark environments. Like I'm all about like exploring different models and seeing what works and doing the experiment. So
Yeah, and I think it's a really great way to think about it. What does the different structure incentivize? And there is a whole category of people that I left out when I made the academia private dichotomy, which is like citizen science, right? There are, especially in the rare disease world, there are many families that become world experts over the course of years while they're trying to figure out the best thing to do for their child or themselves, right? And so you that community is definitely underserved by the traditional academic funding routes and the private funding routes. I was also interested to see during COVID some of the other other tests of new funding mechanisms like fast grants that a group of people in Silicon Valley did. And at one point, I was on an email with a fund that was created by Vitalik Buterin, the Ethereum co-founder, that was doing something similar where they were funding health research. And basically, we want to do it fast. We're going to ask for an idea on a piece of paper and a call. And if it's a good idea, you're gonna go and run with it and not take weeks and months to make decisions. And I think it's interesting to just see that experimentation. There have been a lot of good outcomes, I think, out of those fast grants in particular.
yeah, absolutely. The fast grant surge was so exciting. I've written about that in a couple articles, and then also on the kind of Web3 side of things, Gitcoin grants, they still do, I think, quarterly rounds, and they've had a lot of DeSci rounds within that as well. And people can raise pretty easily. And I think now that, we're seeing Bitcoin up again, there's been another resurgence
Yeah.
of financing some of these projects, which is really cool to see. There was a story the other day for someone who launched a coin called Mira, Mira, for a father whose
I
daughter has
saw
been,
that.
yeah, suffering from a disease, and they raised like, I want to say it was in the millions, almost
It was a
overnight.
huge amount of money.
Yeah, and he's actually, I think, donating some of that money to other rare disease foundations now to help them with
14,
their research.
$14 million they raised.
Wow,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, that was always one of the draws, I think, for people into DeSci, was like this other this other source of capital as well, where a lot of humans are incentivized by how we can get things done. So
Yeah, I'll link to a story around that one because I was following it. I saw it pop up on Twitter in real time, and it was wild. Basically, this he's a tech CEO and founder, and his daughter unfortunately was suffering from a very rare disease, and he put a call out on Twitter saying he put out a standard GoFundMe and said we're gonna donate to research for the lab, right? But then somebody else created a meme coin and donated half of the tokens to him. And I won't do the story justice, but it ends up running up to be worth $100 million or something in total, and they end up being able to donate 14 million. The backstory to all this is that someone has basically speculated on that asset put a bunch of money in, and there are, in a way, there are winners and losers to this, where there's some person who is betting on this on the internet, basically. But the winner was ultimately the Hansen lab, wherever they were, that got $14 million to do research into brain tumors, as well as the speculators that bought on the way up. So it's really interesting. Like it makes you think, right? It makes you think about who the winners and losers are in this, and how these things are structured.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, like, and I do want to temper the excitement. I feel like I was very much an evangelist of the space for a while there. But there are a lot of scammers out there, and it can be a very fickle space to operate in, to a point where I remember having a conversation at a conference I went to around meta science and talking about these themes of new organizations and new, fundraising types. But just I was sharing that I was now very suspicious of anyone I interacted with on the internet after spending time in this crypto world,
Yeah.
to a point where, like, I'll admit to you, Patrick, that when you reached out to me about being on this show, I'm always like suspicious of links. Is this real?
Right.
Is this person real?
He's gonna
Doing
ask for
vetting.
my Bitcoin private
Yeah,
key.
he's gonna
Here
send
it
me a
comes.
link and try to get access to my wallet. And so I'm very like that's the mindset that I,
Yeah.
accrued from being in that space. And that's unfortunate. Like I want people to be very cautious with their money and
Yeah.
how they interact with people in that sector, because there's some really good human scams out there where they just find a way to interact with you like another human being, and at the end of the day they're trying to get access to your wallet or whatever it is. So.
Yeah. And we don't need to go down the AI rabbit hole, but I've been seeing stories where they use the voice impersonation, and it's scary good. There was one with, I think with Charlie Puth recently, the famous musician. There's a whole rabbit hole I went down over the weekend on this, but they pretended to be Apple, and ended up getting into his account. The backstory behind it was there's a criminal group that apparently split apart, and one half, to get revenge on the other half, like shared some of the things that they've done previously. So there's this video of the actual behind the scenes him getting scammed. So there's an element of necessity to that risk posture, right? You also don't want to be completely credulous on the internet, and get in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about that side of it.
Yeah,
Like like scams are everywhere in this world we live in, and we have to make sure people can arm themselves against these
yeah.
things.
On a different topic, you spent many hours, like I have, on podcasting. You took a little bit of a hiatus, I think, in 2024, but you have dozens, maybe approaching hundreds of episodes of the Lady Scientist podcast, where you interviewed lady scientists that are at the top of their game, and all sorts of different things. What's the story behind that, and do you have any favorite interviews or favorite interactions that you had from that time?
Yeah, you know, I loved the podcast model as a way of learning. I mean, I think a lot of us are drawn to that. I'm sure you
Yeah,
as well. Just conversations in general. I've always been a person who loves a good conversation, and um, I saw a space for me to start to talk to women scientists and share their stories, because I would go to conferences and I wouldn't see some of my female friends who are scientists. I just wouldn't see them up on the stage
yeah,
necessarily, or sharing their career stories. And I thought there was a better way to do that online, so that anyone could access that content, right? And you never know how a conversation is going to impact someone's life or their journey. So yeah, I mean, again, kind of during the pandemic, I had actually just accepted a new position at Tune Therapeutics around the time I started, and I just started out interviewing my friends and getting to know this medium of podcasting. And it was really fun. I learned so much from their experiences. I learned so much about how to share their stories and highlights. I mean, so many. I was just thinking about a conversation I had with one of the postdocs I worked with at the ISB actually in grad school, Allie Paquette. She had been studying placental biology and human reproduction and the impact of environmental toxins like phthalates. And there was just this, Twitter conversation about this project called Plastic List. And this is why I was thinking about it again. But that conversation was so illuminating for me. It was one of the first interviews I did. And even though I had worked with this person, I'm actually a collaborator with her. I've published with her on these multi-omic studies. I just like hearing her perspective of how she takes her science and how that impacts her in her regular life, how it impacts her decisions as a consumer of food or, or hair products or whatever it is. Like that was one of the first times I really started thinking about plastic contamination in our food supply and in our products, and very insightful. And another conversation was with a researcher who studies how decisions are made in the brain. So Kanika Rajan, she's at Harvard now. And it was just so illuminating. Like it was so mind opening. I remember feeling like there's something about just having that one-on-one conversation with someone and really getting into how they think about their own research, because there's like this day-to-day nitty-gritty of like, okay, I did this experiment, I put this graph in this paper, and it's all very flat in a way. But I'm always interested in like translating those insights, and like how does the person who's doing that study themselves think about these things? How do they think about the limitations of what they're doing? How do they apply it to their own understanding of the world? Those are some of the fun parts for me. But also just sharing their stories, sharing their legacies, and that can be more meaningful than you even realize in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of my favorite episodes are from people who've never been on a podcast before and haven't really had a chance to tell their story in any way. And it can be really nice to just, from like to listen to somebody reflect and share things that you've never heard before because they've never been on the stage or they've never talked about it. So I definitely agree with that. Some of the most interesting ones are not the famous people. Some of those are very interesting too, but sometimes you hear the same thing that you've actually read in their papers for years, and it's not necessarily a fresh take.
Yeah.
You probably part of the reason you haven't been recording as much as you uprooted your life about a year ago, right, and moved to Mexico for what you're working on now, which is what we referenced at the top of the show, the TAM Center, where you're focused on cancer cell therapies. It'd be great if you could talk a little bit about what you're focused on, and will probably help us understand where, from your perspective, the edge of innovation is in cancer treatment right now, because I think that's what you're focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a step back and just say a lot of people when I made this move about a year ago, and it's still to this day, I think are trying to wrap their heads around how someone makes the leap to build something in another country or build something in Mexico. And really one of the biggest draws for me, I had been interacting with the leaders of this organization for a couple of years, attending their scientific advisory board meetings and learning about their process. And one of the founders and owners, Ed, kept asking me, if you could build a cancer clinic from the ground up, what would you want it to do? What would you want it to look like? What therapies would be options for patients? What diagnostics? Um, and it always felt so, again, mind expanding. Like I just like this idea of like what could you do without the constraints of building in the traditional US biotech sphere, right? Like most of
Yeah.
my work at that point had been along this very traditional path that involves um, building out drug development programs in companies where you're essentially having to um, argue or champion specific ideas, and very few of those make it to the clinic, and then very few of those get approved by the FDA, right? Like I think of it as like the Olympics of drug development in a way. Um, and it felt so crazy to just think about doing things in a different world, and doing things in a different regulatory environment, and having the freedom to um, build out what I wanted to build out. So that was like the draw. It felt really extreme, and I'm now, very grateful that I had the networking group of people advising me at that point in time, including my dad, um, about taking this type of risk, and moving my family to another country and working in such a different space. But now having that reference point of like, here's what I was doing in the US, here's what I was capable of in this specific type of environment, and here's what I'm capable of now. And I've grown so much. Like I feel like I have new limbs,
Right.
from
Well,
the
what is it? What are the big things that feel different? Because I guess the from a regulatory perspective, you're able to do a lot more, I guess, than you can do in the U.S. What are the kinds of things that feels different for you for where you're operating today versus in the much more constrained FDA approved environment in the U.S. biotech?
Yeah, and I want to temper it too, and just say there is a very specific regulatory structure in Mexico, with and it's called COFEPRIS. And I like to tell people it's regulated, but it's regulated differently. So all of our protocols need to be translated into Spanish. Mexico requires signatures on everything. Again, these are kind of boring parts of it, but there are things we need to comply with here, that might be different, might be harder than the US. But from the perspective of drug development or building out these programs, it's a much more direct relationship in my view. The ability to get feedback from COFEPRIS seems more direct than what I was familiar with the FDA. Our legal representatives of our organization can uh, visit with these leaders and get their feedback regularly. And I think we have an opportunity to advance new products much quicker than the U.S. Regulatory path. So there's an opportunity for licensing of certain approaches. For instance, stem cell products here. The government is well familiar with a lot of the clinics that bring in medical tourists seeking things like stem cell treatments. And these clinics can operate using licenses that are a little bit easier, still require auditing and specific documentation, but it's not like the traditional phase 1, 2, 3, path that a lot of companies in the US have to go through. So
Yeah.
yeah.
The common criticism that I know you're familiar with with stem cell treatments in basically parts of the world that aren't the US that don't have as rigorous of oversight is not clear whether they work or they're safe, right? How what I think is you can't operate under different principles, right? You might decide that the core principle for you is autonomy, individual autonomy, and someone can accept uh, and make an informed decision that this particular therapy hasn't been approved in the same way that it has in the FDA. But I'm curious how you think about it because it's very easy to take one position or the other, right? Everyone should be able to make complete independent and free medical choices with no oversight, or to take the opposite position, which is, look, it's possible to get scammed, for example, if you don't have that oversight. So I'm wondering how you think about it, because the truth is in many cases in the middle on these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's almost the same plight that we were talking about with DSI, where there are scammers, there are people who take advantage of these systems, of course, and people should be cautious about where they seek care. For me, I had been working on stem cell derived therapies for several years, and I knew I knew about their potential both as differentiated products from naive cells, but also just as naive cells. But it really was the data that I was seeing from some of these treatments, especially for things like intradiscal repair. So people who have experienced disc degeneration of the spine are often suffer pretty severe back pain and mobility issues, disability. And you can actually do intradiscal injection of stem cells with a biocarrier and see pretty dramatic improvements in pain and disability on the order of around 80% of patients improve, and it's pretty remarkable. And I think, again, there's been a lot of media around the hazards, the frauds, these people in this space that maybe their cell product wasn't as good, maybe they weren't doing things in a rigorous way, and also just in the broad scheme of the development of these therapies, some of these protocols have now been worked out to a much greater degree than I think people appreciate. Like there's actually been randomized controlled trials for these types of therapies in Australia, for instance, and other places. So at this point, I think the evidence is pretty good for some of these stem cell therapies to actually be beneficial for certain indications like disc degeneration, chronic back pain, even lung repair, the lung data. There were several studies that happened during COVID for long COVID patients, and also for pulmonary fibrosis. So, people who have fought in wars or firefighters who have pretty severe pulmonary fibrosis, we see pretty decent benefit from some of these stem cell therapies. So yeah, again, I want to caveat, like there are places that I imagine take advantage. For me, obviously, I have to be very careful about working with people who have the same values as me and same integrity, and I've been able to learn from this system here and how we go about setting up something that's hopefully as rigorous as any lab you would visit in the US.
Yeah. What is your what's your thinking within the realm of cancer therapeutics? Are there areas that you feel like are really difficult to get to patients and have benefit in the US that you'd have a better shot in the environment you're operating in? I'm curious to learn about those.
Yeah, one of the big things we've been talking about here is how do we get the cost down, because the field of cancer immunotherapy and CAR T therapy in particular has really been suffering to some extent by the insane cost per dose for these approved CAR T products, which I think last I checked there were at least 6. And they all hover around this $500,000 per dose price point, which is crazy. And as someone who originally was working on the early drug discovery, I'm the scientist who's like, which protein are we going to target and how are we going to modify these cells? I never thought about the cost. And now that I work in a hospital setting, in a clinical setting, and in a setting where patients are traveling here and paying out of pocket for treatments, you have to think about it. Like we really want to get these cell products down to, $10,000-$20,000 a dose, way cheaper. And it's hard because and I like to tell people this, this is the third wave of drug development. The first wave was like small molecules, second wave biologics, third wave cell therapies, and they're the most complex and the most expensive, because you're not just using like a few ingredients. We're talking very complicated protocols for the first program we're developing here. you know, we're using several different cytokines to stimulate these immune cells. We're using several different media types. The cryopreservation media alone costs around $500 a bottle for 100 milliliters of cryopreservation media. And that's the most common cryopreservation media in the US that all these companies are using. So imagine the vats of the stuff that they have to pay for. It gets into like the ethics of like these vendors and the people making all the ingredients that go into it. It gets very, very pricey. So we've kind of been trying to go back to basics, and I actually, track the price of each ingredient, each component, and think about ways to get that price down, because ultimately that's going to make these therapies accessible to people beyond the US as well. Like a lot of countries don't even have CAR T therapies as an option for patients. I mean, Mexico as an example, very few people I think in Mexico have received a CAR T product. So we really could be one of the first, institutions to develop these things in an accessible way. And there's other people working in this space, of course.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It reminds me a little bit about, I read a story recently about a press release about a company called Gemma Bio, which spun out of University of Pennsylvania. And they've, I think, raised $100 million, including quite a bit from Brazil, to look at developing gene therapies much more cost effectively. Because the manufacturing process is incredibly expensive, and the approach was fairly similar. We have a country in Brazil with 200 million people, a major health system, and very little access to current generation of gene therapies because they're so expensive. And it was an interesting. It got me thinking about ways to both better serve the people of that country, but also use some of the available manufacturing capabilities that might be an order of magnitude cheaper than what you can get in the U.S. Because you located in a country that has a lower cost of living, for example. So I think it's very thought-provoking. It's interesting to think about where this might go with some of these third generation therapies that you talk about.
Yeah, and we've really been applying that thought process to everything. Like how can we make our own, proteins or peptides or media, like if there's anything that we can do to simplify, reduce cost while ensuring quality of the product, we are exploring it. And that's also been really thrilling working here, because it's like, okay, let's just see how far we can get with this. Like how much can we bring in house and do more cost effectively. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, this has run longer than most of our interviews because we had so much to talk about, but I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. If people want to keep track of you or your work, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, primarily at Jocelynn Pearl. Feel free to reach out to me, about what we're doing. And yeah, I'm always online, so happy to hear from people.
Our whole generation. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks, as always, everybody, for tuning in. And we hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Patrick.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.